Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Samuel, and I am from Group 1. Today, we will be narrating about the case Donahue versus Allied Newspapers. The case of Donahue versus Allied Newspapers is a simple one, and I will be narrating on the part of the plaintiff, Mr. Donahue. Steve Donahue was a jockey and had been a very successful one for many years. Thus, journalists had been wanting to talk to him and interview him. And on one day, a journalist from Allied Newspapers came to interview Mr. Donahue and got his stories. The stories about how he was racing and how he became good at it, how he bonded with his horse, and all the other adventures that he had done, including his drinking escapades and other such secrets. Secrets which he had chosen to talk about in his own book. See, in Mr. Donahue said he wanted to write a biography about himself after he had retired from racing, because what else was left for him? However, he found out soon that a journalist from the Allied Newspapers wanted to write an article about the same thing he wanted to write about. Thus, Mr. Donahue started a court case for an injunction to stop the Allied Newspapers from being able to print it. When the case was taken to court, Mr. Donahue claimed that he first had the idea to write this article. However, the courts decided elsewhere. When Mr. Donahue went to court, he claimed that the only reason that the Allied Newspapers had gotten the idea to do so was because of his stories, and because the stories were about him, and he was the one who told them that he should have all rights over the story. I will now pass this on to my friend Ash, who will explain on the part of the defendants. Later on, you will also see Mahira, who will be explaining on the part of the judge and the ruling and why it was given. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ahmad Fadin Ashram, and I will be representing the defendant side of the case, which is Allied Newspapers Limited, and I will also be explaining the facts involving the case from their behalf. A few years after successfully publishing several articles in the News of the World, Mr. Felstad decided to reuse the details he had from these publications and publish them into another newspaper. In 1936, Mr. Felstad offered these details to a man named Mr. William Lees, which is the publisher of the newspaper named Guides and Ideas. And he suggested that an article called My Racing Secrets by Steve Donahue would be perfect for the paper. The idea of the article was to reuse the details used in the original articles from News of the World, but with a reduced length and new details added, to portray it as a new and original article to the public. Assuming the plaintiff, Mr. Donahue, had given consent to this idea, Mr. Lees accepted the offer and paid Mr. Felstad 300 British pounds for them. However, Mr. Felstad was actually lying about the consent given by the plaintiff, as Mr. Donahue was only notified and asked for his consent after the payment was made to Mr. Felstad, which was later rejected by the plaintiff. Consequently, as soon as the articles was published in the newspaper, Mr. Donahue immediately complained through solicitors and stopped for the publication of these articles, which what started this case to be brought to the court. The complaint was made by the plaintiff as they believed that Mr. Donahue was the owner or part owner to the copyright of these articles, as the details was originally supplied by him. However, according to Copyright Act 1911, someone may have a brilliant idea for a story, but if that idea was shared to an author that displayed them into any form of product like a book or an article, the author was the one to be considered as the owner to the copyright of the book. So by applying that theory to this case, it can be seen that Mr. Felstad does own the copyright to the article and not Mr. Donahue. This is because it is true that Mr. Donahue originally supplied the story, but Mr. Felstad was the one who displayed the story through the newspaper articles, simultaneously making Mr. Felstad the copyright owner of the story instead of Mr. Donahue. That is all from the defendant's side, and I will pass it on to the judge's side to conclude the case.
After listening to all the facts presented by the plaintiff and the defendant, the judge held that apart from the embellishments that were provided by the defendant, Mr. Felsteed, the stories and the ideas of the stories themselves were provided by the plaintiff. However, the judge also added that the language that was used to convey the stories was the language that belonged to Mr. Felsteed. As much as the stories were told in the format of a dialogue, and there is no doubt that the defendant tried to preserve and reproduce the story as it was narrated to him by the plaintiff, the judge still held that the language that was used to convey the stories and the adventures of the plaintiff were told in the language of the defendant and not the plaintiff. Even though Mr. Donoghue is the one that provided the substance of the articles, the article and the information contained in the articles themselves were written in the language of Mr. Felsteed and not Mr. Donoghue. The judge also added that the plaintiff, Mr. Donoghue, has failed to show ownership or part ownership of the copyright of those articles. Hence, Mr. Donoghue is neither the author nor is he a joint author of the articles. The action was dismissed with costs. Thank you.